When I was in my early 20s, I became more and more aware of my relationship with my anger. My perception of my anger at the time was that it was destructive. It destroyed my relationships, it isolated me from community, and even had a durable effect on my health. When I could access the full potential of my rage, it was indeed something to behold, and anger became one of the easiest emotions for me to access. I could reach for it, and it would be there to engulf me in a fire that was strangely comforting. One day, after an exhausting fit, I decided to seek therapy for my anger, and access to therapy at that time was unpopular with me and my friends, and it was very expensive. I was uninsured at the time because the jobs that I qualified for did not come with insurance, and purchasing insurance was almost a financial impossibility at that time. But when I was in it, therapy allowed me to speak to someone about what happens when I'm angry, where it comes from, and how I can manage it. And one of the more revealing qualities of my anger was it was usually triggered by how unfair something was. It was unfair that I didn't have access to health care the way other people did. It was unfair that I made so little money in exchange for complex physical labor that would often have high stakes. It was unfair that access to higher education required thousands of dollars I didn't have, thousands of dollars in student loans, or otherwise it was unachievable. My therapist then remarked, "It seems that you have an internal sense of what justice looks like. And when something seems unjust, it causes you to have these moments of anger." And at the time, the statement rolled past me like tumbleweed. But looking back to what we've uncovered that day, I can see that this statement is a foundational truth in my life. My anger was not sinful, was not evil. My anger was a human response. It was a human experience. My anger had been trying to pry my eyes open to larger and complex systems of oppression for years. And most importantly, it put me on a path to learning what that means to me and what I should do in response. Ultimately, it led me to the work of Latin American theologian Gustavo Gutierrez. And Gutierrez's work is undergirded by the deductions of the Second Vatican Council in 1965, where the Catholic Church was guided to form a closer relationship with the people. He wrote a book called A Theology of Liberation in 1973. Where he spoke about three forms of poverty: spiritual poverty, voluntary poverty, and material poverty. Spiritual poverty is a radical openness to God, and this means a deep relationship with a higher power in a pluralistic sense, and sets the stage for the moral framework of liberation theology. For our humanist siblings, this may be a call to an openness to the love of humanity, all of humanity. Voluntary poverty speaks to the act of releasing wealth in order to be in solidarity with the poor. Relinquishing the excess of your wealth to those impoverished helps to cultivate empathy. It helps us to feel and know and understand what it means to live in poverty. A great example of this is the Order of the Franciscan Brothers of the Catholic Church. Members of the Brotherhood are called to a vow of poverty because it helps to act the will of God by being with the poor. The third form of poverty is material poverty. It is the deprivation of the things that an individual needs to sustain a dignified life: clean drinking water, nutritious food, decent clothing, oxygen, shelter, education, healthcare, and anything required to live a decent quality of life. This aligns with what we try to do with the first and second principle of our faith tradition, Unitarian Universalism, which is recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of all people and to seek justice, equity, and compassion in our human relations. Liberation theology is the idea that God always sides with those who experience material poverty, those who live in the margins of our society. To follow God, we must work towards answering the needs of impoverished people. Now, in our society, poverty may be widely known as a lack of wealth, and because we live in a capitalist society, this may seem like a good definition, but using the language outside of the context of capitalism, it also helps us to reveal those who are genuinely suffering. Gustavo Gutierrez defines poverty as an early and unjust death. An early and unjust death. This definition encompasses all systems of oppression and may even lead to uncovering systems of oppression that are still unidentified, systems we are unaware of either through our privilege or ignorance. Gutierrez notes that liberation theology reflects what's known as praxis, and praxis is our action in the world in order to carry out this moral framework. These include the three-step response of seeing, judging, and acting. Seeing requires a sacred witness to unjust systems that perpetuate material poverty. The New Sanctuary Coalition was an organization that worked on seeking to protect our undocumented siblings. People from that organization often accompanied undocumented people to the court appearances in order to affirm that they are loved and wanted in the community. It also provided sacred witness in order to identify state-sanctioned injustices. A few years back, this congregation served as witness called to the work of liberation, as members here accompanied Luis de Leon as he made his way through the injustice of immigration detention, a trial, and then, blessed be, a release. I also remember a time when clergy would take pilgrimages to our southern border to witness the appalling treatment of refugees seeking asylum. They returned to their congregations and their wider communities to recount what they saw and experienced. Every Wednesday, this congregation's volunteers serve as a witness to the poor in this community by offering meals and community through MESH, which is short for Montclair Emergency Services for Hope. This is critical and necessary in the work of liberation theology. It calls us to be present in places of injustice. And the second part is judging. Judging is perceiving injustices through the lens of a God that sides with the oppressed, or the lens of a society that sides with those in the margins. It isn't enough to say that you are firing someone from a job on the basis of their sexual orientation. We must also say that this is wrong. It isn't enough to say that driving up the cost of insulin deprives citizens access to health care in our country. We must also say this is wrong. It isn't enough to witness the creation of legislation to control the bodies of women. we must also say, this is wrong, this is unjust, and this is wrong. And now that we've seen and judged, finally we must act. And acting is the response to fixing or tearing down structural systems that support material poverty. And in the reality of capitalism, it can look like a lot of things. Some people feel called to direct action. Some are called to support legislation. Some are called to use their wealth and influence as a form of voluntary poverty. None of these are wrong. The only time any action is wrong is if it keeps the structural systems of oppression intact, or worse, if we go through the trouble of identifying an injustice and then doing nothing about it. Ever since I learned how to tame my anger, I realized that this darkness is a gift that sets fire to my creativity, my boldness, my writing. It allows me the courage to stand here in front of all of you and deliver a message of love and resistance. My anger helped me to adjust my vision, and I'm now able to see riots and marches and labor strikes and join in their anger and join in their struggle under the weight of oppression. It causes me to empathize with their suffering. I invite everyone, to be offended at injustice. Allow it to sicken you and anger you. Be with the many others who are not just disgusted by it, but are harmed by it on scales known and unknown to us. This is not an easy or comfortable task. Here, in this congregation, your social justice coordinating team has chosen the action issue of reparations. This work requires a stoking of the crackling power within you, within all of you, to empower you further to continue your work with the oppressed. I will end by reading a quote from Eugene Debs when he was convicted of the Sedition Act by the Supreme Court. And the quote reads, "Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." Amen, and blessed be.